Hello everyone, Namaste. I'm Nikita and today we are going to be doing watercolors on our still life drawing. So if you haven't watched the part 1, I have linked it in the description. So just go and watch the part 1 video where I've explained the sketching process, especially when you're painting from life, everything about measuring to the sketching process to how to look at the objects in terms of various shapes and forms. And now today we'll be doing the painting part. We'll be talking about all the aspects of the painting as well as the shading. So that starts from highlights, shadows, midtones, color mixing and watercolor techniques. Let's start with it. Starting off with the steel container, I prepared a very diluted mixture of vermilion red and phthalo blue. It gives us a very muddy or a very dull grayish color instead of a purple. And then in some areas you can see in the reference also where the steel is glowing, I've added a little bit of yellow ochre in those spots. Wherever there are a little bit of shadows and midtones, there I'm adding grays. And wherever I see highlights, basically the areas which the steel is reflecting from the surroundings, in those areas I'm adding a yellowish tint. Okay, so it's a combination of a bluish gray and a very dull yellow ochre in some areas. Now moving on to the base color of the tomatoes, I'm using vermilion red and permanent orange mixture, or you can even use Indian yellow and mix it into your red. So you can see I've left out the brightest highlights in the tomatoes white. I've preserved those highlights as the paper white color. And then in the reflection on the steel container, the reflection of the tomatoes on the steel container, I'm using thicker paint. The reflection you can see in the reference also, it's a little bit darker than the real tomatoes. So I've used thick paint for those reflections. The highlights and the shapes are a little bit different as well. It's important to give a slight orangish or yellowish tint as the base color to make the tomatoes look more juicy and more bright. Now I'm using a thicker mixture of phthalo blue and vermilion red for the darkest areas in the steel container, like the shadow in between the lid and the container, and then the handles and the top knob. So I'm using this thick mixture. It looks like Payne's gray or indigo. You can use that color directly as well. And you can just give a base color, lifting out some of the highlights with a clean and damp brush if you want. So right now we're just giving a base color, we're not worrying too much about highlights or shadows. Moving on to the brinjals, I'm using a mixture of violet plus a little bit of vermilion red. I'm really sorry I couldn't record the process for some reason, and I'll be going over this process in the second layer as well, so I'll explain that in detail. It's just that I gave a very light wash of purple as the base color, and then I added some darker pigments as shadows. For the ceramic, I'm using the same mixture that I used for the steel. That is a mixture of very diluted phthalo blue and vermilion red. And in some areas, you can see I'm adding a little bit of, like a hint of yellow ochre in some of the spots, just to make it a little more warmer and just to make it a little more brighter. One important thing you may want to notice here is that I have preserved the highlights for all the textures, be it steel, the ceramic, brinjals, tomatoes. The most brightest highlights, that is the paper white highlight, that I have preserved as white only. Now moving on to the second layer where we'll be adding the midtones and the shadows. So you can see I prepared a mixture of yellow ochre and violet. It is a very interesting mixture. It gives us something like a burnt umber. You can experiment it with burnt umber as well. This is basically a reflection of the wall that is behind the object. So the steel does not have its own color much. Like steel is mostly grayish or blackish in some areas, but all the other colors that you see on steel textures is basically what is around it. Okay, so it reflects whatever is kept around it. It could be the surrounding walls or the objects lying around it. So you can see I'm adding almost like a black mixture of brown and blue, and I'm adding it to the darkest shadow areas, the handles, the knobs, all of those areas. You can prepare this mixture by adding all the three primary colors, or you can use Payne's gray plus a little bit of burnt sienna. Avoid using pure black because it makes every other color that is around it muddy. Black makes everything very muddy, so avoid using pure black straight out of the tube. Try to mix up your own black by using blue plus brown or the combination of three primary colors. So in the steel, in some areas I'm using that brown, or in some areas I'm using that gray. As I come to the base of the steel container, you'll see I'll be using more of the violet and the red as well as the gray, because the brinjal and the tomato reflection is getting reflected onto the container. Here in the lid, it's the wall that is around it and the ceiling that is above it that is getting reflected, so it does not have really bright colors as of now. Now I'm mixing almost like a black mixture using red, blue and yellow, and I'm just darkening the shadows. So one interesting fact about steel is that it has the darkest shadows possible, like almost black shadows, and then suddenly it has the whitest, the brightest highlights, like the paper white highlights. So this is what makes it look so glossy and reflective, almost like a mirror. Okay, so to get this glossiness or the reflective surface texture, you have to take care of the brightest highlights. Especially when you're using watercolors, you need to preserve those highlights in the first layer, the base layer that you do, and then you have to add contrast by adding the darkest highlights as well. So you need to use the darkest value that you can use for the areas which look almost black. Okay, I'm not using straight from the tube black, I'm preparing my own black, but you can see it looks like a really dark value. So this value contrast is very necessary to show the reflective or the glossy nature of an object. Now using the same yellow ochre and violet mixture for the base, and you can see I've applied a very diluted mixture towards the left because the steel is reflecting the base, the white of the paper that's lying on the base from the left, and on the middle it's reflecting the tomatoes, and on the right it's reflecting the violet from the brinjals. Okay, so the brinjals almost look black in the photograph that you see, but I'm kind of exaggerating the colors in my artwork. So as artists, we have this liberty to exaggerate the colors. I know that it's a reflection of the brinjal only, so I'm keeping it more on the violet side. I'm not doing it completely black. Of course, I'll add more values to it later. I'll make the violet darker, but I'm not using straight black in this reflection, and I am kind of exaggerating, or you can say I'm making the colors more saturated in my artwork in comparison with the colors that I see in front of me. Okay, so in some areas I'm using that brown, in some areas I'm using that gray. The base color, that is a slightly yellowish tint, I'm leaving it as it is. Now I'm just adding more details to the base of the steel container using that gray and a brighter or a darker violet, a more thicker violet for the reflection to add more value. You can see the value is very dark. So to make the steel container look like a glossy surface, almost like a mirror like surface, you have to take care of the darkest values as well as the brightest highlights. You can see I have left out the paper white highlights as it is. I haven't added any white paint in those areas. Whatever areas that you see are looking very shiny or it's looking very bright, that is not white paint. I've left it as it is. Now I'm using a mixture of red and a little bit of brown. You can add red plus blue plus yellow as well to make a maroonish kind of color that I've used for the reflection of the tomatoes on the steel container. Now I'm taking another slightly thicker mixture of vermilion and Indian yellow. You can even take vermilion with permanent orange for the second layer of the tomatoes. I am adding the shadows with a slightly maroonish mixture. You can add a little bit of blue to this red to make it a little darker. So the blue has to be very light, like the blue
proportion has to be very little, otherwise you'll end up with almost like a black color. So mostly it's red plus yellow, a little bit of blue into it to make it like a maroon color. Okay, so in the tomatoes I'm using a little bit of the lifting technique. So you can also call this the thirsty brush technique, where you use a clean and damp brush to lift out your highlights. In some areas of the front tomato, I am using a little bit of yellow ochre as well to add a little more warmth to the tomato and to make it look more brighter. And again, I'm using the maroonish tint wet on wet in the shadow areas, which is towards the top and the left side. Now I prepared a muddy purple using vermillion and phthalo blue, and I'm adding the shadows. You can see I added a little bit of that orangish mixture that I used for the tomatoes for the shadow as well. So it's as if the color of the tomato is getting reflected onto the white surface. You don't see this color in the photograph, but I added it to make it look more interesting. I'll be following the same rule for the brinjals, for the shadow of the brinjals and the steel container as well. So as artists, you do have the liberty to exaggerate the colors or to experiment with shadows, highlights, like the color temperature of the shadows and highlights, the color mixes. You don't have to do it exactly how you see it in the reference or in front of you. You can do your own thing. In fact, you should try experimenting with your own mixes, because that is what makes you grow much better, and that is what teaches you much more as well. If you try to follow the exact same colors, then you will end up with a very photorealistic artwork. If you take the liberty and try to go in your own way with your own kind of colors, with your slightly more vibrant or more saturated colors, then your artwork is going to look better than the reference picture or better than your still life composition. Okay, so always make sure that your goal is not to make it exactly like how you see it, but to make it better than what you see in front of you. Moving on to the brinjals, I'll be taking direct violet in the shadow areas, and then I'll be adding a warm red into the violet in the areas which are surrounding the highlights or in the mid-tone areas. Okay, so here you can see in the shadow areas or in the darkest areas I'm adding pure violet, and as I go closer to the highlight, I'll be adding a little bit of red. You can take scarlet lake, vermilion red, pyrrol red, any warm red, add it to your violet just to make it a little more warmer. Okay, so we're making our violet a little warmer by adding red, and we are keeping the violet pure or a cool violet in the shadow areas. So we are following the same rule that we follow in portraits as well, that the shadow areas are a little cooler and the highlight or the mid-tone areas are a little warmer. So regardless of your subject, this rule is universal. Like, always make sure that whatever you're painting, whatever your subject could be, your areas, the area where the light is hitting directly is usually a little on the warmer side, unless it's a colored light that is hitting, unless it's a blue light that is hitting that surface. So if it's a natural light or a white light hitting a surface or a warm light hitting that surface, the object looks a little warmer in the highlight and the mid-tone areas which is around that highlight, and in the shadow areas that color becomes a little cooler. So both the brinjals, you can see I'm doing it wet on dry, but I'm adding the cooler violet and the warmer violet side by side. So you can see both the layers are wet side by side, so it's diffusing effortlessly into each other, and keeping in mind that the brightest highlights need to be kept paper white. So always make sure to preserve your highlights as paper white no matter which layer you are working on. And you can see here in the shadow of the brinjal as well, I've added the violet just like how I did it in the tomatoes, and then that Payne's grey kind of mixture in the base, and then violet as I go further away into the edge of the shadow. Okay, so here the green that I'm using is a mixture of phthalo green and yellow ochre. You can even use sap green plus a little bit of yellow ochre, and I'm doing it very loosely. I'm not doing it in detail, Moving on to the ceramic bowl, here I've mixed up yellow ochre and a tiny bit of red into it to make it a little more orangish, and I'm adding the details on the yellow details on the ceramic bowl. You can see there's a flower pattern in the ceramic bowl, so now I'll be adding colors to that pattern. I haven't drawn it with my pencil, I'm just doing it roughly with my brush. Before that, I'm adding that gray shadow, one more layer of that gray shadow, using a warm red and a cool blue, that is phthalo blue and vermilion red. You can substitute your red, warm red. It's not necessary that you need vermilion red only. You can take scarlet lake, pyrrol red, or cadmium red for your warm reds, and for your blues, the cool blues, that is phthalo blue that I'm using right now. You can use cerulean blue or very diluted Prussian blue as well. So after adding another layer of that grayish shadow, now I'm taking phthalo blue and a little bit of red into it to make it a little muddy, and I'm just quickly drawing the pattern on the bowl. You can see the pattern is looking smaller in the back side of the bowl, and it's looking like the flowers and the leaves are looking smaller and as if they're shrinking on the back side, and they're looking the right shape and the right size in the front side. So this is what you call is foreshortening in your objects. Whatever that is closer to you looks bigger and the shape looks accurate for those objects. Whatever that goes away from you, or whatever that is a little away, or maybe going at the back side, curving to the back side, that kind of becomes a little smaller in size and a little distorted in shape as well. So, one important learning whenever you do still life is that you should take different textures in front of you, like intentionally pick up different textures, like ceramic texture, which is opaque. You can take glass texture, like transparent glass as well, and then, of course, the vegetables which are glossy in different colors, and then steel texture. So all of these textures, once you start studying it, like how the highlights and shadows form in different surfaces, in different on different colors, it's a very good learning for you. Before you start learning portraits, you should practice these kind of textures as well, so that you get to know how to make a glossy finish, or how to make a matte finish. Like in the ceramic also, it's a little glossy, so you can see I've left out white highlights in the tip and in some of the areas around the brim. So it's important that you need to study the glossiness or the matte finish or the satin finish of the texture that you are planning out, and then accordingly you have to prepare, or you have to preserve the highlights and add the shadows later. So all of this goes hand in hand. You have to relate your texture with your shadows and highlights. Now moving on to the ginger, here I've used yellow ochre plus a very tiny bit of violet into it, which gives us something like a raw sienna kind of color, and I've added shadows into it, and now I'm adding a cast shadow of the ginger onto the base, where again I've added a little bit of the same muddy yellow or the brownish yellow. Okay, so in the shadow, in the base color that I painted in the previous layer, I used pure yellow ochre. Now in the shadow areas, I'm adding a little bit of violet. So you can see the same rule is being applied to all the surfaces, no matter what the color or the texture is. So in the highlight on the mid or the mid-tone areas, I've added yellow ochre. In the shadow areas, I've added yellow ochre plus violet, which is a cool color. Okay, so violet is a cool color, so I've added cool colors for the shadow areas, warm colors for the highlight areas. I just added a little bit of texture to the ginger, wet on dry, very loosely, and now I'm adding the final layer onto the brinjal, which is quite dark in the reference in the objects that are kept in front of me. So it's almost looking like a blackish violet, but I'm not going to make it so black. I'm just going to add another layer over it, increasing the value of the shadows, but at the same time keeping in mind the brightest and the whitest highlights, which makes the brinjal look glossy finish. Okay, so in glossy textures, you can see almost all the objects here in this still life are glossy surfaces, except the ginger. So in glossy surfaces you have very bright highlights. That is what makes it look shiny. If you lose that white highlight, then suddenly you will feel that your texture looks like a matte finish, or it looks a little dull. It does not look shiny anymore. So this is the rule for painting glossy surfaces, that your highlights need to be the whitest possible. Especially when you're doing watercolors, you need to keep that in mind before you start with your first layer. So you need to preserve the white of the paper. Now I'm just adding finishing touches. I'm just increasing the values wherever I feel that the value needs to be a little darker, and I'm just adding the darkest values on the steel wherever I see that the details or the shadows need to be even darker. Wherever I see the almost black reflections onto the steel, I'm just adding few loose strokes in those areas. I think we're almost done. I'm just adding the shadows, the cast shadows, making the cast shadows a little darker, which is closest to the object. Right under the object, the cast shadow is usually darker, and as it goes away, it starts fading out. Okay, so I'm using that grayish mixture using red and blue, and I'm just increasing the cast shadows. I'm increasing the values of the shadows in the tomatoes as well using that maroonish mixture. So basically in the last layer, this is the final layer, I'm just doing final touches, that is increasing the values, and wherever I feel the values could have been a little more darker, I'm just adding more layers to it. Now moving on to the background, whatever colors are left over in my palette, I am just diluting them and adding a very watery consistency layer in the background, just to let go of the pure white background that is there right now. I'm just adding a very light value to it. There is no particular color that I'm picking up. I'm just picking up random colors. Whatever I see is left over in my palette, I'm just adding a lot of water to it, and I'm just covering up the back side of the objects, the background of the objects, with these random colors. And with this, we are almost done with our still life. I really enjoyed painting this. Like, I don't do live painting much, but I really enjoy it. So I think I should do it more often now. Live sketching, live painting has a different feel to it because you have to do it a little quickly. So I loved making this video for you. I hope you liked, or I hope you found it useful as well.
I just wanted to end this video with a close-up of my wooden palette. I am in love with this palette because it is made out of real wood. It's quite heavy, and then you can see how beautiful it is. These are the wells where you can pour your watercolors, and then this is the mixing area. So it has a lot of mixing space as well, and I really love it. In case you would like to purchase it, you can click at the link in description. It is available at aquatoneartistmaterials.com, and you can get a 10% discount using code Nikita10. Bye. Thank you for watching.